Thanks. Well, hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me over here back to good old Europe. It's fun to be back. This is like my first excuse since I went over to stateside to actually come back and interact with people in the industry, so I feel privileged. Whereas kind of Adam kicked off the morning by talking about the way social media is shaping urbanism. I think what I'm going to do is do it the other way around. I'm going to try to explain what I think is a sort of important and profound shift that's happening right now and that's going to accelerate, where mobility and urbanism is kind of feeding back and changing some of the very core sort of social networking terminology and concepts that we're used to when we build websites on the web, companies like Google. So what I'm going to do is structure this talk around three basic concepts. I've basically talked your ear off about the first one, if you're familiar with any of the work that I've been doing, which is this concept of the social object. But I'm going to start with that just to introduce it to those of you who aren't familiar with it. And then I'm going to talk about social peripheral vision, which is really my take on microblogging and at the foundation of basically the reason why I do what I do and what I believe in. It's kind of this idea that we can augment our social life through these technologies by giving each other this kind of peripheral vision into what's happening. That's going to help us to plan and organize and meet and kind of come together in new and interesting ways that fulfill. And the last point, these nodal points, this is a new concept. It's something that I have never talked about before, so I'm a little I'm not sure how it's going to go. But let's see, and I need your help. But I think it's really something that's emerging. It's something that I've only started to see after joining Google, and I'm excited by it. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll start with something that I often like to start with, which is a problem. This is Mark Segal, who recently, just a few weeks ago, wrote on his blog about this unhappiness with what's kind of happening right now in the social software industry, where there's a lot of excitement about Facebook applications, and Mark was basically saying there's got to be more to the story, guys. As cool and fun, as entertaining as Facebook apps are they really the future of Web 2.0? Or is there something more meaningful, something more profound that's going on that we really should be paying more attention to? And I think he's right. I think that's true. Not all Facebook applications are one-dimensional pseudo-apps, but certainly a lot of them are. So I'm going to take a look at what I think informs a lot of the conversation here, which is sort of built around this hype, this excitement, and rightly so, around this concept of social networking. Personally, I find that concept to be problematic. My background is in sociology. I was trained as a sociologist, not as an engineer. So I tend to have a particular perspective on this, and I'll quickly explain what that is and why we arrive at this concept of social object that I think is a useful tool when we're designing websites and online services. So when we recall the term social network, this is the image that normally comes to your minds. It's this idea of a map of the relationships between individuals, where the nodes represent individual people and the lines represent the relationships between those people. Now, there's something missing in this picture, and if you go into literature, you find that there is a critique going on about this notion of the social network. It's basically saying that social network theory is great at representing these nodes and these links between people, but it really does not explain what is the reason why people connect to each other in the first place. What's the object that connects them? And there's another tradition of theorizing in sociological literature, exemplified by some of the folks that I put out there on that slide, that I think gives a better explanation of why so many of these yet another social networking services fail, and why some, indeed, are very successful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. First of all, it's important to realize that people don't just connect to each other. They're always connected through a shared object. It's like us here today. You know, there was a reason why all of us came together here, and that shared object is really this conference, the web and beyond, and what it represents. It's our shared interest. And we're in the process of kind of concretizing that now in the conversations that we're having in the lobby and in these discussions here. In a more mundane way, think about two objects. Think about something like a date, and think about a job. And how, in daily life, they tend to connect most people to two very different groups of people. So when we think about services again, we realize that oftentimes we need to be kind of trying to understand what is the object. When you go on a website, you know, next time you go and browse the web, you end up on a social site, ask yourself, how quickly can you point out what is the social object that this web service is trying to connect people around? And usually if you can't tell that in a blink of an eye, that website's got a problem. Sometimes the social object's not that evident. It's not easy to find. Here's an example from a favorite example of mine from a friend of mine's book, John Thackeray's book, In the Bubble, where he kind of gives the following image, and it's clearly a social event. You know, people have gathered in a barn somewhere. Turns out this is in northern Italy, and they're having a social event. But it's not evident in this picture what is the social object that's connecting these particular people together. Well, turns out if you go outside, you see it out there in the fields. It's actually potatoes in this case. So these people have been brought together because they're unhappy about the quality of the potatoes that are being served in supermarkets. And instead, they've decided to go and grow their own organic potatoes because they think they taste better. These are people who are part of the slow food movement. They grow their own organic potatoes. It's their hobby, and it's their diet, and they're passionate about it. And they're very social in ways of, you know, explaining to each other about, you know, how to do this in a good way. So, similarly, when you think about the services online, I think really the best services always kind of allow us to create social objects that somehow add true meaningful value to our lives. If you go back and you think about Mark Segal's point, I think this is what Mark's trying to get at. It's that maybe he wasn't so happy with the quality of the value that was provided by some of those Facebook applications he'd installed. Then you look at some of the other examples of sites out there. These are just some of my favorites that I think do a very good job. Flickr, for instance, turned photos into social objects. Now we've got someone here who was partly responsible for that, Ben Cerveny, who's going to be speaking to you a little later. So this is an example of a case where we have something that already exists, a photo. It's a defined, well-defined object out there in the world. And what you tend to get is when someone like Flickr comes along, they turn it, they kind of invent, the first to invent a really useful way of putting that object online in a way that it enables people to come together around it. Flickr invented, you know, things that most photo sharing services were not doing at the time, things like commenting, tagging photos, that turned this idea of, you know, just browsing photos into a much more social experience. Delicious is an example of a bookmarking service that does the same. I use Delicious in my own when I'm doing research on my PhD, where I've had instances of bookmarking a particular sociological article that someone's written that I think is completely obscure because I'm in such a narrow, concentrated focal point. You know, I'm trying to look at something that I don't think pretty much anyone else in the world is really looking at. And I bookmark an article, and then I go on Delicious and I find out that 3 other people have bookmarked that same article. In that case, turned out one of them was a Japanese graduate student. When I then kind of go and I see the other articles that he's bookmarked, they all deal with the exact same topic. Turns out that student was working on a PhD on exactly the same topic that I was working on, and I was able to benefit from all the other material that he'd already gathered on this topic. YouTube is an example of a service that grew very large very quickly, that really kind of managed to take over the video clip as a social object. So one of the lessons here that I think is exciting, especially when we think about mobile, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is that whenever we get a new species of social object that emerges, usually there's a huge opportunity there for someone who's able to kind of come together and build a usable social service around it, and be the first one out there to create a lot of value. Now, mobile services are exciting because they make it possible to capture slices of reality that people couldn't capture before. You think about the photo, for instance, and really, arguably, what made Flickr possible was that we kind of solved this, what Steve Jobs used to call the chain of pain. This idea of taking a picture with a digital camera, transferring it through a series of steps, first to your computer and then online, where really mobile phones arguably were a big part of that, kind of simplifying that whole process and turning it into something mundane that a lot of people were able to start using a lot more. So you think about, the current services out there for photo sharing, and I don't know, but in just casual conversations with the founders of Flickr, for instance, they do acknowledge that camera phones played a big part here. You think about something that I'm more familiar with, this idea of status updates, microblogging, services like Twitter and Jyri, and it's clear that a big part of these microblogs has been sort of what they're really doing is turning these SMS text messages from a one-to-one medium into social objects online, around which networks of people can come together and form these kind of knots in the network and share more widely. And now, interestingly, we're seeing this kind of current rise of streaming video services and video commenting services like Quick and Seismic that are kind of in the process of perhaps doing this to video captured from mobile phones in the world in real time. Now, interestingly, we're now at a moment in time where there's a lot of excitement over in Silicon Valley about the upcoming release of the iPhone 2.0, the iPhone SDK, people writing native iPhone applications. We'll see how big of an impact it has, but I think there's a potential here of something happening that I think was similar to what the microscope did to natural science back in the day, where the introduction of a new instrument suddenly opened up an entire new world of new species that people weren't aware had existed before. And it could be that with the advent of really usable, really easy to program mobile devices, we experience something similar where we kind of, encounter a completely new family, a set of new species of social objects that we really weren't aware that had existed before, especially online. You think about stuff like capturing the cell ID, capturing location through GPS in a very simple and quick way. No one's really yet managed to turn this concept of a place. We all know it's a very social concept, and there's a lot of social networking that happens around places. There's a bunch of really exciting services out there, services like Places in Germany, and a bunch of these that I'm excited about. But it's clear that they're still waiting. None of them has grown as big as YouTube yet. And perhaps it's because we're waiting for the devices to kind of catch up and make it as easy to bookmark a place as it is easy today to take a picture with a camera phone. Think about things like Bluetooth, some of the things that we've been working on in Jyri and other companies like a Danish company, Imidi, that was recently acquired, have been doing is turning the Bluetooth MAC addresses that your phone discovers into social networks about people you've met, so you can kind of go back and browse in time and see who you've met, see how you're connected to them on other social networks like MySpace. And things like barcodes, RFIDs, the ability to turn physical objects into social objects online and find out who else is interested in them using the same technologies that were already discovered in other circumstances like tagging, commenting. So these are just some of the examples of, I think, of the potential of when we get these new sensors that connect at the edges of the internet, what potential I think they have. Now, this is a lot of talk about objects, right? And they're interesting as such. I'll give you an example. Here's a photo. You know, it's a decent photo. It has personal meaning to me. It's me with my little kid. So it's something that I could put up as my background on my desktop. You know, maybe frame it, keep it as a personal token, you know, something that I appreciate. But when it really becomes interesting in the context of being put online on a service like Flickr is what other people say about this object and what the other people do with it. To me, that is interesting. It's even more interesting, actually, than perhaps my own personal relationship to it, because it enriches it. So it's just something that Flickr introduced not too long ago. You know, this idea for me to kind of get this stream of information, of the actions that my friends perform upon the same object, greatly enriched my, you know, the kind of my experience of having a social relationship to them through that object. So I want to talk a little bit about these streams because I think they're important. What they're really doing is logging events. And in order to have an event, you need some kind of a performance of an action. So we've been talking about objects, and I want to introduce this other term now, which is the verbs. So not only do you need social objects, but you need to define, as a designer of a service, what are the key verbs that you want your users to perform upon that object that then leave these traces that are meaningful to other people. You look at some of the best services out there. There's an example of eBay, for instance, on this slide. And if you go on eBay, immediately next to the logo, the first two words that you see are buy and sell. It's very clear what are the things that eBay is expecting you to do that are social things, social verbs, social actions around the objects that eBay presents to you. Another favorite example of mine is a friend of ours, Ted Reingold, who runs a service called Dogster and its sister service Catster for cat people, where the key verb when you go on Dogster is add a dog. So to kind of try to just gel this into, you know, a very, very simple model, you have a person, you have a verb, and you have an object. And you can kind of model in this A, X, B way. And then you can just replace the person with the name of someone, the verb with whatever verb you encounter in the online context, and then the object with these very different, you know, objects that we currently have. And then I find this is useful. For instance, personally in my life right now, and I'm in a situation where I'm in a kind of new situation. I find myself not only, you know, kind of working hard and building my own startups, but also looking at things from maybe slightly more of an investment perspective and sort of scanning what's out there. And this is my own kind of map that I use to think about this. Is like whenever I see a new site, a new startup that's introducing a new verb or introducing a new object that seems to make sense, I think that is a sign of excitement that something really new, potentially big, could be happening here. So, drawing back into, you know, sociology, there's actually a bunch of theorists who've, I think, you know, used various theoretical concepts to talk about these actions. My favorite one is cultural historical activity theory, where this guy, Russian psychologist Leontiev, conceptualized these as actions and operations. But there's others too. There's John Searle has been talking about speech acts. Habermas obviously talks about communicative action. And in the field of conversation analysis, CA, there's these notions of utterances and turn-taking. So this is me sort of trying to bring together this idea of social theory and to show how we can use that when we're designing services to try to design them better. I think there's a lot of connections to be made here, and I would like more people to be actually thinking about these in these theoretical terms, because right now I personally think that the world of tech and the world of social media and the world of social science are oddly disconnected. Okay, so going back to the story. So these actions, they leave traces on the web, right? Now, some of those actions we type ourselves, like in the case of Jyri and Twitter, where we're typing our status updates. And in other cases, these actions are auto-generated by the systems that observe us. I think Facebook is a great example. It's just doing this into our newsfeed without us even always knowing. What this all accounts to is this notion of social peripheral vision. It's us having the ability to detect what's happening in the periphery of our vision as we're focusing on our daily lives. Especially nowadays, when you look at the structure of society and how it's changed, where we're suddenly spending most of our lives not actually in physical contact with the people we care about the most. Even in our nuclear families, we have kids traveling, going to school in different cities, maybe even on different continents, like in my case, but still retaining a close emotional tie to our family members, our friends, in those other parts. Even if we live in the same city, we actually spend most of our time in working and school in physically disconnected from each other. So this is really where electronic and social media comes in, and where it's important and useful, especially in the mobile context, is in giving us that idea of co-presence, even when we're physically disconnected from each other, through a way of staying aware of what the people who matter to us the most are up to at that moment. That's social peripheral vision. And what it can do, when used properly, is you think about, the canonical example of Wayne Gretzky, who, the greatest hockey player in the world, knows how to skate to where the puck is going to be, whereas the players that are merely good but not great are always skating to where the puck is right now. So it's the same idea here, where when you have this peripheral vision, you're able to get the picture of the whole, and you're able to make more efficient plans. Without it, we lose almost completely the inability to make plans. It's like when we're driving, to come back to TomTom, if we can't see the traffic around us, it makes us pretty bad drivers. Now, there's a bunch of sites out there, and there's a whole new genre of social services that are built around this idea of social peripheral vision, Facebook being the biggest of them. And all of them are really doing is publishing this news feed. This is just the Facebook example, the Jyri example, there's tons of these. So I think these are interesting when we think about how we can, where is this going? What's it going to look like? And actually, I think one of the most intriguing examples of what's happening is in the world of gaming. This is just a screenshot from World of Warcraft. I think World of Warcraft really has taken this to a much more advanced level, this idea of social peripheral vision, than what we currently have in the kind of real-life services that we use, where gamers are able to develop their own hacks of modules that sort of live in your heads-up display as you're operating in this virtual world, and giving you information about where your co-players are, what objects your guild members have acquired so you can trade with them, stuff like that, sort of even as you're operating in this world. And you think about this new generation of kids that are growing up with this media, what's going to happen when they enter the military, when they enter the commercial world? They're going to expect to be able to have these same conventions, these same UI conventions that they're used to, that they've grown up with in the worlds of gaming. They're going to wonder, why don't we have these available to us when we're driving, when we're doing the work that we're doing, just kind of operating in the urban environment. And I think that's a really exciting and cool new space to be thinking about. So what's really happening here is we have these sort of object lockers, places where we store these objects. And then we have these activity aggregators, these services like FriendFeed, that are pulling the actions from these object lockers that people are doing and trying to aggregate them, present them to you in a feed. It's kind of like something that's happening in the field of natural science when you think whenever there's two bodies that collide, any kind of action that's being performed on an object, it always releases energy in some form, waveform, radio waves, heat waves. And what we're doing, I think, in the case of Jyri is like, to me, this was an experience of like being a radio amateur, building the first radios and trying to detect the signals by, pulling RSS feeds and all these actions, trying to pull them together and display them to people in a useful way. And moving over to Google, you know, this is suddenly happening at a much, much bigger scale. This is the largest radio telescope in the world. It's located in Puerto Rico. It's something like 17 acres across. And it's the most sensitive instrument we have for detecting, you know, these activities, these signals from space. And I kind of draw a parallel here to what I think is like, you know, just the kind of massive computing capacity available at Google is sort of exposing, at least me personally, to a whole new set of questions. It's about questions that mainly deal with pattern recognition. And, you know, this is just a screenshot from the movie A Beautiful Mind that some of you may have seen, which I think is one of the most, you know, nicest examples of where the lead actor sort of, you know, has this ability to detect patterns in a most fantastic way that eventually ends up driving him crazy, but that kind of gives him this really amazing ability to see what other people don't yet see in the data. And it's something that, you know, it's also the title of my talk here. It's these nodal points. This is a term from William Gibson, the science fiction author, in his book Idoru, where Colin Laney, the protagonist, has the same ability to detect from activities, these traces left by famous people on their credit card records, on GPS, on all these various data banks, you know, pulling them together and just by scanning at the data, being able to detect their future, being able to detect that someone's actually going to die before they actually even do, in the case of that novel. And I think these aren't as extreme examples, but I think that there is a point here about being able to sort of detect from this aggregate data of the actions that we are performing and our social networks are performing, and being able to provide us not the whole unfiltered set of data, but just those nodal points, those points that seem somehow worthwhile to be able to deliver as something that interests us at that very moment. It's questions like, what should I be aware of that's happening around me right now that I'm not seeing by just standing here, but my phone could tell me by being able to trace things that my friends are willing to let me know about the activities that they're performing around the world right now. From a network perspective of, you know, building these services, every single event that's detected, there needs to be an algorithm that's able to say, is that event somehow significant to someone else on the network at this very moment? Trying to answer the questions, who's involved, where is this happening? You know, using social proximity, physical proximity to determine whether it's, you know, two people might be interested in each other at that very moment. And I had to put in the sort of TomTom slide to kind of make the point here that especially when we're talking about sort of not just creating the content on mobile services, but feeding it back to you in the form of disruptive messages or you know, on-screen display of something that's happening. How do we know when to present you with the right information at the right time so that we don't disturb you at the wrong moment? Now, just kind of going back to the online world and the world of players like Google, I find myself going back to an article that David Sachs, the former CEO of PayPal, wrote a while ago, where he talks about these portals, you know, portals like Yahoo and Google, and what their future is. And he sort of presents this picture where he says, well, portals really evolved from this browse portals, what Yahoo used to be in the early days, into the era of search, where Google has really dominated keyword search. And then he wonders where this is going. And he presents this alternative scenario that we might be going towards, from search towards this world of share, where we're really getting the information that's important to us at that very moment, not so much anymore from these active actions of going to search for something that we know we want to know about, but rather by having kind of like a continual search algorithm that's being performed all the time based on all the input we know about where I am, who I know, what I've been doing, and then feeding that back to me, filtered through my social network in a way that will let me know when there's something happening that the system thinks that I should be aware of at that moment. And now the interesting thing here is to figure out the algorithm that's going to work. Obviously, in the case of Google, well, arguably, they developed PageRank, which arguably could be said to be the most valuable algorithm in the world at the moment, in the era of search, that's able to determine which web pages are most likely to be the most relevant to you whenever you search for something. And obviously the way they did it was by being able to look at who are the other people who are linking to that web page. Now the question is it time now to kind of develop a new algorithm? I don't know what to call it, so I just quoted FaceRank here. That's based on social proximity, physical proximity, the shared taste, the shared objects, and being able to use these as a filter to then deliver us the information that we need at that very moment in time. All right, well, I'm going to close it here and just sort of, as a recap, go through this quick checklist. So whenever we're talking, not only as developers, but also as consumers, you know, what is the object that you're performing on right now, that you're looking for right now? What's the object, if you're a developer, you know, that's actually going to be the key that's going to pull people together on the service that you're building right now, whether it's for yourself as a product or as a service for a customer? And then what are your verbs? Really think about this. Are you able to define what are the key actions that you want people to do on the site? And then lastly, I think this is the new emerging question, is what are the nodal points? What are the triggers of action that should cause your service to somehow come back to the user and tell them something that you think they should know? So I'm just going to close here and open it up to questions.
So, who would like to ask the first question? Because if you don't, it'll be me. Oh, yeah, okay. Can I get down this side? No, I can't. Who was waiting?
Hi, my name is Steven Stibung. I found it interesting that you put a World of Warcraft slide in there. And I'd like to draw a parallel to the first keynote presentation, where the presenter talked about these artificial commercial spaces, which basically what their aim is you know, to keep you there, you know, having you buy stuff, etc., etc. And you know, I don't want to be like pessimistic about the future or anything, but I can imagine that these digital social spaces, you know, since they're defined by commercial forces, like World of Warcraft, become kind of places that, you know, want to keep people in there as long as possible. And I think World of Warcraft is one of the most successful examples where people, you know, or in extreme cases, tend to get immersed in it and, you know, be in there like 90% of their time. Yeah, so how do you see like the morality there, or, yeah, you know, that dimension? Because I think things like MySpace and Twitter are already kind of like going into that direction of, you know, keeping people into the digital realm.
Yeah, I think the analogy to draw in urban space to WoW, World of Warcraft, probably be, you know, these experience malls like Nike Town, which you certainly have no shortage of in the States, that really try to control the experience of the entirety of your stay there. Personally, I saw this in my work at Nokia, for instance, where when we were designing these RFID phones, I felt it was important to give people the ability to hack their own layers on top of the meanings that have been placed there by the commercial actors. For instance, if you have an RFID tag that contains the URL and you touch it with your phone, and it's suspected that, you know, the phone will take you to the URL put there by whoever invested all the money to place the tag somewhere, you should still give users the option to override that on their phone by adding another URL that they want that tag to take their particular phone to, and then letting them share that on the internet so that you can create this arbitrary meanings for those tags in addition to the defined meaning that was originally put there by you know, the shop or whoever put it there. So I think in pretty much all these cases, even, you know, as you might have noticed in my take on WoW, I think the most interesting part of WoW is actually the hacks that users are building on top of the UI. And my take on all of this is very much a federated take, where I think it's important that commercial actors are able to do a profitable business by providing these services, but in the end, it's the users who are creating the data. It's the users who should own the data, and it's the users who should be able to export that data and cut it and paste it into a different context. And then, in this way, sort of you build your own bricolage of how you want to interact with the stuff. So, in the case of microblogs, for instance, I think it's going to be really important for the different microblogs to establish a standard through which you can communicate, so that I don't need to join Twitter to be able to communicate with you if you're on Twitter. Just like I don't need to download, Apple Mail to be able to send you email if you're on Apple Mail. We need these federated models, and I think that's the promise of the internet, is really because it enables us to do this in an efficient way.
Okay. Robert Gaal. Just wanted to ask two small questions. First, you talk about nodal points. What you see nowadays in a lot of social applications is the alert feed, as it were, like the Facebook feed. A Dutch social network, Hives, recently launched their own alert feed, only they call it Buzz. Is that your vision of nodal points? And my second question is, what's the status of Jyri? I'm a frantically Jyri user, and I'm just wondering what's the new features coming out. Is that something you focus on, or are you more working on cool Google stuff, which I can imagine? But yeah, what's the status of Jyri?
Right. Okay, so there are two questions there. First question was, are these activity streams the future of all these social services, or is there something more to that? And I think my point is, right, the activity streams are the state of social services right now. And no, I don't think it's the future. I think the future is right now we're getting this information overflow on all these services, even on Jyri, but certainly on services like Twitter, and Facebook's doing a great example of where they're trying to filter it. And the point of these nodal points is in being able to serve you only the content that's relevant to you at the moment. And it doesn't necessarily need to be in a serialized stream format, but it can be in the form of, you look at the stuff on WoW, for instance, you go and you think a little bit further into what we're going to get in the coming years with the ability to have, embedded stuff in our glasses when we're in the physical environment, and we start to realize that we want things that are superimposed on stuff when we're looking at people, when we're looking at objects, that's pulled in, that's socially user-generated, like in the TomTom example. So I really think it's going to take new forms. And what we're seeing right now in these activity streams is just like the beginning, the raw data, the raw logs. The second question was about Jyri and what's the future of Jyri and what new features are we working on. And right now we're in a kind of death valley with Jyri, where it's taken us a while to integrate it into Google. We wanted to build it on top of Google's App Engine, which is a new product Google recently launched that enables web developers to write applications that rest on top of Google's really gigantic infrastructure that basically enable them to scale up very quickly if they need to. And Jyri is sort of developed as a lead application, the first real application with a significant user base on top of the Google App Engine. And that's what we're working on right now, is that App Engine port. And when we have that completed, it's going to free us up to developing new features on top of Jyri. And we have some pretty exciting things that we're pretty excited about in the works. That said, we're also working on Google.com specific services and trying to kind of build this idea that I've been talking about here, social activity, and turn Google into an actual social service that hasn't historically been Google's strong point. And that's something that I'm spending quite a lot of my time on right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jyri.
Thanks.